Our cell phones bear witness to our insecurities, patiently returning search results for things that spark in our brains that we need immediate answers to. Mine, if you were wondering, would absolutely tattle on me for my deep election anxiety. It would rat me out for my searches about what happens to my public interest loan forgiveness program if the Department of Education is cut. Army Sergeant Perry's phone laid out a path to radicalization, winding around his interest in underage girls, past his views that Afghans weren't people, and ending in murdering a racial justice advocate. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. I think we have to start this episode with a bit of background to get us into the right context. On May 25, 2020, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck for approximately 8 minutes and 46 seconds, killing him. The following day, a months-long wave of Black Lives Matter protests began, highlighting racial injustice in policing. Around that time, Daniel Perry, a 30-year-old Sargent, Texas native assigned to what is now Fort Cavazos, tried to make some extra cash moonlighting as an Uber driver. He'd spent long months isolating due to the COVID-19 pandemic, bored with nothing to do but fixate on a distaste for social justice warriors, and make seemingly false reports about daily roving packs of Black Americans attacking police officers, Fort Hood military police, and soldiers with impunity. It's actually a bit surprising that he was able to continue as an Uber driver, because in June he texted a friend that he'd been arrested after drinking and driving, but he said the cop did him a favor and arrested him for public intoxication instead of driving under the influence. Additional messages to other friends indicated that in either this incident or a separate drunk driving incident, Perry got in an accident with someone who was conveniently more drunk than he was, and that he hit the jackpot because their insurance would replace his damaged vehicle. In still another thread, he said he was concerned about an accident he was previously involved in, an accident in which he hit a Black pedestrian while driving 55 miles per hour. Worried, I think, because he thought it could be seen as racially motivated. It's not clear to me how many of these sordid confessions are true, but I, for one, would hope that a man who hits a human being with his car and then drives drunk wouldn't get to retain his license, let alone a job on a rideshare platform. But perhaps that's just me, a woman who doesn't take rideshare solo after hearing one too many concerning tales of a driver passing the drop-off and refusing to stop, or following a friend out of the car. One of his Uber fares brought him into the Austin area, nearly 70 miles from what is now Fort Cavazos and what was then Fort Hood. As he navigated the downtown Austin area without a passenger inside, he found himself near the July 25th Black Lives Matter protest. On July 25th, 2020, Perry had just a few weeks left before, allegedly, he would leave to go train and work as an Army recruiter. Garrett Foster, a 28-year-old Air Force veteran, legally open-carried his rifle while marching in the protest. I am not personally for guns, let alone guns in public spaces. But I can see a world in which Garrett believed he needed to be armed to keep himself, his wheelchair-bound fiancé, and his fellow protesters safe. I'll take an opportunity here to mention that the majority of the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests were peaceful, though some escalated into riots and skirmishes between police and counter-protesters. Those, naturally, received more coverage in the news, which makes sense because they were the ones that departed from the norm. I think there are a lot of tropes about who participated in the Black Lives Matter protests following George Floyd's death. And I don't think it should matter that Garrett Foster was white, but I'm not convinced that it doesn't matter. As you all know, anti-racism protesters can and should include every variety of American. Exercising the First Amendment right to peaceably assemble and call for necessary change is one of the most American things I can think of. While Garrett marched along Congress Avenue, Perry blew a red light and turned his car into the group. Protesters said they feared Perry might use his vehicle to hurt them, perhaps thinking of the car-turned-lethal battering ram targeting counter-protesters to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, just a few years earlier. Perry claims that turning his car into the group caused Garrett to raise his rifle and point it at Perry's car. But to be clear, in his initial statement to a responding officer, Perry said Garrett did not aim a gun at him, just that protesters had banged on the hood of his car, the car that he had turned into them. After Garrett did or did not point his rifle at Perry's car, Perry withdrew his own handgun and fired 5 shots, killing Garrett. It seems the smoke didn't even have an opportunity to clear from Perry's revolver before he drove off. He later called 911. The following day, Perry messaged a friend of his to tell him that he was attacked and that he had to defend himself. But following the shooting, disturbing details about Perry and his beliefs began to emerge. He used violent rhetoric online, openly fantasizing about shooting, quote, looters. He dreamed of standing on a rooftop wearing a Make America Great Again hat, shouting, "Looters will be shot, leave the area immediately," through a megaphone. He hoped he could count down to 0, then declare it open season on the human beings below. I don't know what personal stake Perry had in this scenario. It wasn't his property that he would be defending. I guess defending is a word that we can technically use here, but I don't think it's quite the right fit. His fantasy wasn't even specific to the Fort Calabasas area. Perry texted a friend that he might go up to Dallas, about 2.5 hours away, to shoot looters, to shoot people. He had used his phone to search for protests in Dallas, though the metadata didn't make clear when he ran that search or where he was when he submitted it. He ran similar searches for protests in Austin and near the Alamo in San Antonio. He also searched whether the federal government had the ballistics of every firearm legally sold. For what it's worth, Perry was familiar with violence in Dallas. In 2005, he was arrested in Dallas, which I believe is his hometown, for assault causing bodily injury. He pled no contest to the charge about 1.5 years later. That conviction arose because Perry, then 18 years old, violently assaulted his 16-year-old sister. They'd been on the bus on the way home, and his sister told Perry not to open her music case, and the two squabbled as siblings tend to do. She slapped him on the arm, and in response, Perry leapt up, pushed his sister into the seat, and punched her, closed fist, numerous times in the head. He was ordered to pay a $400 fine and court fees. He also had to make a paltry $25 contribution to a women's shelter, take an anger management course, and attend a domestic violence impact panel. Then, Perry joined the Army. 4 years before he murdered Garrett, Perry messaged someone on social media that he was afraid to go outside because he'd almost gone to jail for defending himself. There isn't much context that I could find as to what that could be, whether that could somehow be the arrest in the incident with his sister, or whether he was just really good at finding opportunities to defend himself at someone else's expense. Another conversation the year before Garrett's death showed Perry messaging someone looking for extra work, lamenting that it was too bad he couldn't get paid for hunting people of the Muslim faith. He celebrated Trump's commitment to retaining Confederate names on military bases, which, frankly, I find confusing. Being a traitor is a big deal, that's why it qualifies for the death penalty. Perry was stationed at what was then Fort Hood, which was named after Confederate General John Bell Hood when it was established in 1942. It's not as though General Hood was still around and kicking, or some brilliant mind that the Army should forever embrace, though perhaps it's worth mentioning that he promoted from brigade command to brigadier general in just 11 days. But I think that says a lot more about the slapdash nature of a rebellion than his actual skill, but I'm admittedly biased because I am not a fan of the Confederacy. General Hood fought against the Union, fought against the United States Army, and in 1942, nearly 80 years after the end of the Civil War, they slapped his name on the Tank Destroyer Training Center because he was a local good old boy who'd led the Texas Brigade. Lest we forget the social climate at the time, I would like to refer you to episode 43, covering the Port Chicago 50. Perhaps relevant to the calculus of his intention when he began to drive into a crowd are a series of remarks Perry made and memes that he shared about hitting protesters with cars. Of course, there's no way to know what Perry planned to do while staring down his hood at the people he'd railed about for months. But it's pretty damning to joke about hitting protesters with your car, then ignore a red light, and turn into a group of them. The concerning messages on his phone included playing out scenarios with a friend, trying to hone in on when it would be the most acceptable to shoot another person. He also liked to search ways to chat with, quote, young girls, those are his words, not mine. At least once, while he was chatting with an underage girl, she told him that at 30 he was old enough to be her father. But don't worry, he told another purportedly 16-year-old girl not to send him nude photographs of herself until she was old enough to be of age. He wanted to talk to them, but he would be willing to wait to pounce until his security clearance wasn't at stake. Gross. A year after Garrett's death, a Texas grand jury finally indicted Perry, who'd been transferred to the 11th Airborne Division 1st Brigade Combat Team in Alaska. In April 2023, a jury of 12 impartial Texans convicted Perry of murder. His lawyers argued that this all amounted to political persecution, then turned their attention toward the Army. Hopeful they would take Perry's side, agreed that it was a political persecution, believe him when he said he acted in self-defense, and leave the door open to his return to the uniform. They really hoped he would get to stay active duty. In support of their argument that the Army should hold their horses and delay separation, they assured everyone that purported jury misconduct would invalidate the conviction and necessitate a new trial. Specifically, Perry's defense team alleged there was an outside influence on the jurors because one of them said another one brought in printed copies of research they did outside of the trial, allegedly a section of the Texas Penal Code. This, they claimed, amounted to an impermissible outside influence on the jury. The trial judge denied their motion for a new trial. Garrett's mother expressed her relief that 3 long years after the loss of her son, they were finally getting justice. She said she prayed to God that one day he'd get rid of the hate in Perry's heart. In September 2023, Perry received a sentence of 25 years. Less than 24 hours after the jury convicted Perry, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, called for the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles to review his conviction. Governor Abbott vowed to pardon Perry as soon as he was able. In May 2024, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles decided Texas Stand Your Ground laws justified Perry murdering Garrett and unanimously recommended Governor Abbott grant him a full pardon. Governor Abbott predictably did just that. Within an hour, Perry was released from prison, 1 year and 1 month into his sentence. Abbott also cited Texas's law of self-defense as justification for his decision. He was explicit in his claim that the laws of self-defense cannot be nullified by a jury or a progressive district attorney. I think, perhaps, the governor of Texas does not remember how the law works, which should be a bit disappointing to the law school at Vanderbilt where he earned his degree. Juries are actually exactly the group that gets to consider a claim of self-defense and reject it. They could reject it in this case if they believed that Perry wasn't reasonably in fear for his life, or they believed that Perry didn't need to shoot Garrett to prevent some imminent threat. I'd actually offer that if, and that's a heavy if, Garrett raised his gun at Perry's car when he turned into the crowd of protesters. Perhaps Garrett feared for his life, the life of his partner with whom he marched, and the lives of his friends and fellow protesters. Perhaps the jury believed that if anyone stood their ground and acted in self-defense, it was Garrett. The cell phone extraction from Perry's phone shows someone that, in my opinion, does not make for a reliable narrator. If I had to guess, his initial statement to police, the statement that Garrett did not level a rifle at him and that he'd been startled by protesters banging on the hood of his car, that statement was probably his more truthful statement. The statement he made just after the murder, not after he had time to reflect and decide on a spin. Following his release, Perry's lawyer announced that he was thrilled and elated to be free. He was optimistic for his future. He said he wished he never had to defend himself against Garrett's unlawful actions. As a result of the pardon, he may be eligible in the future to have his record expunged. But with that pardon, Abbott restored Perry's firearm rights. I will drop a quick note here that Governor Greg Abbott will be up for re-election on November 3rd, 2026, to the extent that his questionable decisions matter to you. While Perry continued spinning the narrative that Garrett was to blame in his own death, jurors reacted to the news that their conviction, secured after they spent weeks of their lives listening to testimony, fervently taking notes, hearing that Perry texted someone about his plan to murder a protester he disagreed with, was all for nothing. An alternate juror reflected that the governor's pardon made the trial a waste of her time. She said that the evidence was overwhelming, that it was not just a murder that Perry committed, but that Perry premeditated it. She called him a hammer in search of a nail. Following Perry's conviction, before Governor Abbott's pardon, the Army administratively separated him with an other-than-honorable discharge. He intends to ask the Army to upgrade his discharge to an honorable one. The Texas pardon doesn't extend to the Army's separation process, and the fact remains that Perry shot and killed his one-time brother-in-arms. To be frank, I'm hopeful Perry doesn't receive an upgraded characterization of service, because it seems manifestly unjust that Garrett Foster's service be held in the same regard as Perry's. If Perry was telling the truth about becoming a recruiter, I do wonder about how the Army selected him. Perry, with his predilection for talking with young girls, an apparent deep dislike for the First Amendment, blind to the concept of racial injustice, and a fan of Confederates, does not strike me as someone who can discern between a good recruit and a bad one. He didn't seem to particularly care that the oath he took pledged that he would defend the Constitution, even when people he didn't like were the ones exercising their constitutional rights. So personally, I'm not particularly offended by the stain of an other than honorable discharge on his record, given that the governor of Texas was so willing to roll up his sleeves and scrub out the stain of a murder conviction. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we dive into a case that offers a glimpse into the depths of American unease. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.